So, good morning, everybody. Today, last lecture this term or in this cycle. So, first question is always, do you have questions to what we did last week? We talked about value exchange, right? And we started into digital payment systems. Any questions about that? Then, next question is, did anybody do homework I asked you to do last week? I don't see it, so probably then by definition we have done this. Then my feeling is that probably I should first finish the lecture. I'm not absolutely sure how long it takes because it depends on the interaction with you. And then we should have time in general to answer questions, to ask questions, to answer questions, to do some other exercises you might have done. Okay? So, for me it's really funny that PowerPoint is not any faster in opening files for the last 10 or 15 years. Hardware got much faster, but okay. So this was the last slide we had last week. So the idea was, how do we use blind signatures? Here you have an implementation of blind signatures using RSA to implement one-time convertible authentication. That is, we start with a pseudonym. This might be a test key of any digital signature system. And then this gets digitally signed in a blind way. And then the trick is that relative to this pseudonym, which is a test key of a digital signature system, the holder of this pseudonym can sign messages. And one-time convertible means it's converted one time after it has been signed. So it has been signed blindly, and then it's converted one time. For what do we want to use it? Here we had an additional step 6, where we said in the message sent by the witness B to the recipient, we have a transfer order of money, or we have money, which is Y gets holder of some right. And now the recipient should be able to transform this into a representation the bank doesn't know. So it has to be converted one time. So later on, it may be used in another role, in the role of the payer, in a way that even the bank can't link. In this transaction, the person received the money, and in that other transaction, it's going to spend it. So this was one-time convertible authentication put to use in a digital payment system. Any questions so far? Okay, going back a few slides. It's interesting, or I want to stress, that in this general scheme of a payment system, first, we don't assume any tamper resistant hardware. The bank is running its hardware, and maybe it's protecting its hardware by organizational means in the computing center. The payer is running his or her hardware, and he's protecting his or her hardware maybe by taking care of it. But he can modify anything within his or her hardware. The recipient can modify anything within his or her hardware. So no tamper-resistant hardware against the operator or the owner of the hardware. First statement. So this kind of system can be implemented with minimal assumptions about physical security. So whenever a bank will tell you, hey, digital payment system, it's somehow risky because we are using, these smart cards, and from time to time it's shown that smart cards are broken physically. They are just lying. There's no need to use smart cards. And if they are using smart cards and those can be broken, it's a problem of the banks. It's a problem of the designer of the payment system. We don't need it. If you are talking about an online payment system, there is no need for any kind of tamper-resistant hardware. Point clear, I hope? Okay, if you are going to tell that a bank manager, of course he will be very unhappy. And probably now he is going to invent causes why tamper-resistant hardware might be nice. How he might argue and why it's wrong. He will probably argue that sooner or later the payer or the recipient will lose control over his computer. So you will forget in a taxi, in a cab, your mobile phone, which you use for payment. Okay. Is this a cause of insecurity? Of course, it depends. If everything on your smartphone is encrypted, at least if everything which is valuable on your smartphone is encrypted, then that you lose your smartphone is not really a problem. Of course, you have lost your smartphone. You have to get a new smartphone. So probably you will be unhappy. Hopefully you have a backup of the data on the smartphone you just lost. But assuming you're doing ordinary security procedures, that is, data is encrypted, so if something is stolen or lost, the data can't be used. And secondly, you have a backup, then not really a problem. You buy a new smartphone, you install your backup, and then you continue working. And if you need the data, which is of course encrypted on your smartphone, you decrypt by entering a passphrase those data you need. And after some time, the smartphone is going to encrypt it or re-encrypt it automatically. So please take note that even if you consider that people lose their hardware, there's no need for tamper resistance. You can do the job using encryption. It's only at the point that someone is going to get your smartphone for an hour and then give it back to you again. and then you use it again, that now it gets difficult. Why? Because this someone could install on your smartphone a kind of keylogger which is recording the passphrase for decryption of your valuable data. And then if he's getting to steal your smartphone a second time, then you really have a problem. But the point to note is that you are losing your smartphone and all the data. This is not a problem. The problem might only arise if you are losing your smartphone and if you are getting it back and if you are using it in the normal fashion. So if you are losing your smartphone temporarily and you don't notice. So this might be a problem. And only there we need some kind of, I will call it, a relatively modest tamper detection. With your smartphone, if you lose it, there's not really a need that it's tamper resistant. The attacker might tamper with it. He might get at all the encrypted data. What is important is if he wants to install something, if he wants to modify something, which he usually does by physically opening the thing and modifying some storage content, this should be detected. So what you need on your smartphone is a kind of seal, a paper seal or a plastic thing, whatever kind of seal, which makes you aware that your smartphone has been tampered with, in case you get it back. That's all. So tamper resistant, which is usually considered to be necessary, isn't necessary for a digital payment system. At least it's not necessary for an online payment system, even if you consider losing your devices. I'm emphasizing this so much because it's in contrast to what banks will tell you. And of course, it's in contrast to what smart card industry will tell you. Okay. So this was the first remark about tamper resistant. Second remark is, at the moment, we are not talking about accounts. We are just talking about sending around money, but we are not talking about bank accounts. So in some sense, we could say, okay, very happy. Why do we need bank accounts if we can do without them? Probably you never had the feeling that a bank account is what you really need. You need banking. Of course, bank accounts have some tradition. So maybe we have to discuss what can we do to introduce bank accounts, and maybe we have to think what purpose this might have. And last week already I mentioned that somehow we have to talk about taxes, because anonymity is fine, pseudonymity is fine, okay, but somehow governments have to collect taxes. And of course, now you could argue, okay, all guys being interested in privacy, these are the good guys, so they are going to pay their taxes voluntarily. But okay, this is too simple. So somehow that taxes are paid has to be checked. So how to do it? Of course, what you could do is say, whenever we are moving around money, we are taking some taxes. So maybe each transaction costs you some cents, or maybe each action costs you some percent of the transaction value. So if the transaction value is larger, you're paying more. So this is one way to do it. On the other hand, at least if you look at the current system, this would be grossly unfair because, for example, the value-added tax, you are not paying by each transaction, but only for those parts which are really new. So if you are, let's say, buying a whole product, which usually is assembled by smaller parts, you don't pay for the smaller parts the value-added tax a second or third time. So if you completely bind it on each payment transaction, maybe it's not a good idea. A second problem is usually, at least in some countries, possession of money is taxed. If you have money, if you are really rich, so usually it's not about a few thousand euros, it's about more money, you have to pay some taxes for that. And often those taxes are somehow progressive. So if you have 1,000 accounts with 1,000 euros, and the assumption is these are 1,000 different people, then no taxation. If you have an account with €1,000,000, then usually some taxation should take place. So this is progressive taxation. How to do it? And this may be a real cause to say transfer of money. This could be and should be maybe completely anonymized, completely pseudonymized. But holding money, possessing money for a longer time frame, this should be a personal issue. This should be not pseudonymized, but this should be clear to the state who is possessing how much money. So the state should know how much money you have, but he should not be able to observe whom you pay or from whom you are paid. Right? So this might be a motivation to introduce accounts, because this could be a way to do taxation. For example, it's taxed what's on your account at the end of the year. Or maybe you do it at the end of the day or whatever. And you make sure that all the transfers are closed at that very moment. So at that very moment, each money is in an account. Okay, so let's see it. So what I now will do is discuss with you what can we do, can we simplify if we have secure devices in the sense of tamper-resistant. So my statement was we don't need it, but if we have it, what good use could we make of it? So this is the first step now. And the next will be, how about accounts? So if you have really secure devices in the sense of tamper resistance, that even the operator of the device, even the holder of the device, can't cheat with the device. So the first possibility is you see, oh, the bank has a secure device, so we can now fully trust the bank. We can trust the bank by definition. Okay, if I look into your faces, you have the same strange feeling as I. But okay, if the bank's device or devices really would be secure, then we would have no problems with securing the clients towards the bank. And this would be true for integrity, it would be true for confidentiality and privacy. So if you consider the bank's device as secure. For example, we can get rid of changing all the pseudonyms because we could choose or could use the pseudonyms which are valid outside of the protocol just inside the protocol, because the bank's computer, of course, will learn those pseudonyms, but it's secure by definition, so he will not tell anybody the value, the current bit pattern of the pseudonym. So no need to do this kind of pseudonym replacement. Second thought is, if the payer and the recipient have secure devices, and secure now means trusted by all the other participants within the payment systems. So here with the bank, all the users trusted the bank computer because it's a secure device. And now here, all others trust each one's computer. The computer of the payer and the computer of the recipient. So what can we do? We don't need any computer of the bank anymore, because you can send around the money between the secure devices. And by appropriate protocols, you can make sure that money is neither increased nor lost. Great. No need for any banking computer if the user devices are really secure. We can even go further and say, if the devices of the payment system users are really secure, no need for asymmetric cryptography. If you fully trust the devices, symmetric crypto will do. All you need is that the device is really checking whether the input it gets is from the authentic holder. Maybe you do it by biometrics, by password, whatever you do. But since the devices are trusted, all you need is channels between the devices which are secure. And this usually means they are protected with respect to confidentiality and authenticity, and symmetric encryption will do, and symmetric authentication will do. So to make a long story short, if we are willing to trust other parties' computers, then it gets extremely simple. Of course, I have to admit that I never ever would trust someone else's computer, because I have no clue about the temper assistant which really is present, how good it is, and if it can be broken, whether that person is going to break it, yes or no. And of course, a design like this is extremely risky, because if any of the participants within the payment system is able to break his or her secure computer, then this is the ability to print money. So of course, organized crime will buy a few of those tamper-resistant devices and try to break them, because this is a good kind of business. If you can break it, you can print money. By the way, is there any system which comes close to what I described? At least in the past, there has been such a system. If you think about what we have in Germany called Geldkarte, at least in former times it was on the banking card. I'm not absolutely sure whether this is still Geldkarte, but I assume it is. What was the idea? you had a tamper-resistant chip on your banking card, at least for small amounts. You could just book money on it. And on each device remotely as an offline system, you could pay. So by the way, here with the secure devices, it works at least to some degree offline. Of course, these two devices have to communicate to transfer money. But there's no need for a complete online system. Why? Because a secure device will never copy a bit pattern and spend it twice. It's a secure device. It's trustworthy. So an essential property is this would work offline as well. So coming back to the German Geldkarte. So what they did is you have a maybe trustworthy device on your bank card. You can book money on it and you can spend it offline. And now banks started two kinds of lying about it. The first thing they said, hey, if you want, you get it completely anonymous. This is an anonymous payment system. Why? At least in former times, I'm not sure whether the service is still offered. You could go to a bank, buy a blank card with a Geldkarte chip on it, and load money on it without saying your name, without proving your identity, without any registration. So for your first payment, it was anonymous. You had your card, you could pay. But if you ever decided to pay with your card twice, then you are starting to get less anonymous, because the two payments are related, because the chips have an identity which is transmitted in each transaction. So maybe even after the second transaction, it's not clear who you are, but it's pretty clear that both transactions are done by the same chip, by the same Geldkarte. So it's pretty clear if you're using your Geldkarte for several transactions, then sooner or later it's pretty clear who you are, where you live, and then you, okay, have lost your privacy. So this is the first thing banks don't mention. Maybe the reason is that they don't understand anonymity and unlinkability. Maybe it's a failure that I'm offering this course for free. Maybe I should charge for this course 10,000 euros. Then I wouldn't have students in front of me, but bank managers. But okay, still I think it's for free, and if bank managers want to join, of course they can. Second problem is that banks, and I think now they get reasonable, don't trust their promises themselves. They don't trust the tamper resistance. So what do? Whenever the Geldkarte will be used with another device which is online, the bank is collecting a kind of audit trail. So the bank card here does an audit trail which money was sent to which other card. And whenever possible, banks are collecting these data to build on a central computer, which, if they would believe in the security, wouldn't be needed, to build on a central computer a kind of shadow database. They are building a database which the current value on each of these cards, as good as they can get it, within an offline system. Why? Okay, if you would be able to break the physical security, you could increase the money and spend it. And on the shadow account, because there wouldn't be an increase on the money, because you hopefully are not able to hack the banking computer and increase the money on the shadow account accordingly, sooner or later it would raise an alarm because your Geldkarte would go into the negatives here. In reality, you did manipulate it. It's still positive, your balance. But here on the shadow account, which is reflecting reality much better than what's going on here, your balance would be negative. And this would raise an alarm. It would be clear that at least your chip has been broken, has been manipulated, and your chip would be locked out of the system. It would be put on a blacklist of broken chips. So Geldkarte, as banks try to sell it, comes pretty clear to this scheme, but there are two buts. But first, they don't consider unlinkability. So the promise of anonymity and privacy, I would say, is overly optimistic, if not to say they are plainly lying. Secondly, they are using shadow accounts because they don't trust in the physical security of the Geldkarte chips. So this is what you probably have in your purse, and of course you should know, if you use it, how it works. Any questions so far? Okay, so far then the discussion about how to use tamper-resistant devices. Now, how to use accounts. And in some sense, it's pretty straightforward. You remember the scheme we had, so maybe I should go back here. This was a scheme we had. And what we now do is, after we got money, we have to deposit it on an account, maybe after each transaction or maybe at certain time intervals, because those are the intervals where taxation, for example, takes place. And of course, if you want to spend money, you have to get that money from your account, bring it into a form where it can be transferred in an unlinkable way. So this is what we have here. So first, the payer is communicating in step 1.1 and 1.2 with the bank, getting back the answer of the bank, getting some kind of bank note. In step 1.3, it's deblinding it, because the bank, of course, should not be able to link what the payer then does with the money. And finally, after the step 6, we have steps 7 and 8, where the money is, after the transformation 6, sent to the witness, the bank. And then we have a confirmation of the bank that the money is booked onto the account. So absolutely straightforward. And then, of course, with respect to the accounts, you can do taxation as you like. And if you have the requirement that possessing accounts is only possible if you prove who you are, then if you have several accounts, all the money you possess on several accounts can be added up, so progressive taxes can be collected. Okay, so far accounts. Any questions? Okay, coming back to offline payment systems. We still had them here on the assumption that we have temporal-resistant devices, right? So if you have temporal-resistant devices, everything is easy. Symmetric cryptography does the job. And of course, your temporal-resistant devices, because they are autonomous devices, usually they are mobile, if they are not too heavyweight, because of the temporal-resistant, but chip cards are not very heavyweight. Maybe they are not very secure physically, but okay. So if you have temporal-resistant devices, payment, offline payment as well is easy. So why a special section about offline payments then? Because, of course, the idea comes up, can we build an offline payment system without the assumption that we have temporal-resistant devices? Can we build it on general purpose devices? And the answer is yes and no. Maybe I go back to the requirements analysis we once did. So this was our set of requirements for the payment system, for the digital payment system. And the last requirement was that users cannot increase their rights even if they collaborate. And of course, if we haven't temporal-resistant devices, so users could cheat each other, or they could collaborate with each other cheating. This is probably a requirement we can't fulfill. Because if you are in full control of your device, you can cause your device to spend money twice, or to spend money 3 times or 4 times, how often you like it to spend it. So we said the last security property has to be weakened somehow. So here, in these requirements, somehow it's completely orthogonal to privacy. I don't tell, in none of the requirements, we have any requirement asking that we know the true identity of anybody. It could work well using pseudonyms. And now, if you are talking about an offline system, you have to weaken it and say, okay, if you are completely anonymous, of course, you can cheat. But maybe we could build the system in a way that if you are cheating, then you can be identified. So somehow in each transaction, you are telling something about your identity. And the system is built that if you're doing one transaction, the information you give is not enough. But if you're doing a second spending of the same banknote, then the information given out in the 2 transactions together is enough to identify you. So same idea, please remember the one-time pad. If you get only the ciphertext, no information about the plaintext. But if you get, for example, in the first transaction, the ciphertext, and in the second transaction, you get the key, then of course you get the plaintext, right? So with the one-time pad, you could well say, hey, please, attacker, you may choose whether you want to get to know the ciphertext or whether you want to get to know the key. You're choosing. As long as I'm secure that you only have one possibility to choose, you only get one of the 2, no damage done. Okay, so this will be a kind of idea we're going to use to make sure if a coin is spent twice, the 2 times together, the information handed to the outside world in the 2 transactions together is enough to identify. But any of the 2 transactions alone would keep anonymity, would keep privacy perfectly. Okay, so let's go forward and give you a sketch how it works. It's only a sketch. If you want to read the details, there are famous papers about anonymous offline payment systems. So we have a security parameter K. We have an identity I of the entity giving out the banknote. So this is the person which might cheat. We have randomizations, RI. And we have a commitment scheme. You remember from the DC network, a commitment scheme was something where you could encode some secret such that you can't change it if the commitment information is giving around, but nobody knows what you committed to. And later on, you can open the commitment, and then everybody knows the value you committed to. So this was a commitment scheme. And now a blindly signed banknote could look like this. You have a signature of the bank, and the bank is going to sign it blindly. And within the banknote number, you have encoded the identity of the holder of the banknote. So it's in here, and here, and here. So what's the scheme? If you look to these pairs, first pair, second pair, and so on and so forth, until kth pair, if you look at it, you have a commitment of a random number, and secondly, you have a commitment of the XOR of a random number and the identity. So in the inner part, this is the one-time pad. You have a key, and here you have the sum of the key and the plaintext, and the plaintext is the identity. And it's committed in the sense that if you only get the commitment value, you don't learn what is committed. And now, this banknote is transferred, is spent in the following way. I want you to accept my banknote, so I give it to you. And then you say, hey, I checked the signature of the bank, but how do I know that you didn't hand it out to many of you? So you say, hey, for each of those pairs, I'm making a random decision whether I want the first or the second item be opened. So for each of the pairs, you can ask me for the random number, the key, or the ciphertext, the XOR of the random number and the identity. So you're asking me, giving me K bits, giving your decision what you want to have. I give that information to you so you can check whether this is okay. whether I really give you the information which is committed to.
And what does key means? Why are there so many pairs?
Okay. Now, let's assume I'm a cheater. I'm going to you. I want to ask you, please take the banknote. So you do the same. You're checking the signature of the bank. And you're choosing for each of those pairs what I should open. So I open it for you. I give it to you. Now you accept the banknote. And maybe you give me a can of Coke, and this is what I wanted to buy. Because it's summertime and, okay, drinking is important. Whether drinking Coke is important is another story. Let's assume I cheated. I did spend the banknote twice. How could you find out who cheated? And now this is the answer to your question. If K is large enough, let's say 20, 40, 50, then the probability that at least with respect to one pair, you decided differently. You decided, for example, want to know the random number. You decided want to know the sum of the random number and the identity. If there's at least one position where you two decided differently, then my identity is something you can determine. So if it would be only one, then I wouldn't be caught with a probability of 1/2. If you do it independently, your randomization, then I'm caught with a probability which gets really small, exponentially fast towards 1, right? Now, of course, we have to argue, hey, what's going to happen if we all collaborate? So in particular, you two are asking me exactly the same questions. Then, of course, you can't determine my identity. So you two could argue, hey, bad luck. There was a guy who once bought Coke. He paid with a banknote for an offline payment system, and we can't determine his or her identity. That's bad. So please, bank, cover our claim. Because the bank supported the system, so usually the bank should cover claims. Of course, banks wouldn't be happy to do so, because sooner or later they would understand that clients could form coalitions asking the same questions, and then banknotes could be spent more than once, right? So what's the solution to this? The solution could be that somehow you too have identifiers which identify you within the system, and as identifiers are unique, so any two people have different identifiers. And then if I would say, okay, the questions you ask me, for example, are the binary representation of your identifiers, then even if you would like to cooperate, you couldn't hinder that at least in one bit position, your identifiers are distinct. So even a coalition of the three of us couldn't break the system. So what do we achieve that way? First, you see, hey, this protocol is more complicated. It takes more interactions. And by the way, there are still other difficulties because, of course, I have somehow to check whether the commitments are well formed. That is, if I'm the person asking for the banknote, it's really my identity which is encoded in. And I couldn't encode the identity of Donald Duck or the identity of my worst enemy within the banknote I want to spend many times. So there are some problems to be solved. I didn't talk about them, but there are protocols which solve them. Cryptographically, they are a little bit beyond what we did in this lecture, but if you read the literature, you will find those protocols. So to sum up, what do we have? Even without tamper-resistant devices, we can build up an offline payment system which offers a very good compromise between security and privacy. And the compromise is that if you are cheating with respect to the integrity property, that is, if you cheat to increase your rights, if you cheat to pretend you have more money as you really have, then your identity can be determined with certainty. Now, of course, it's an open question whether to determine the identity of a cheater is enough. If you're caused, let's say, a problem in the millions, and your possession is only a few thousands euros, then probably being determined in the end is not what makes your surrounding really happy, because your surrounding wants the damage to be paid for. But in some sense, I would argue, hey, this is a very, very old story, right? Do you get more empowerment by anyone, by any bank, by any payment system, by any system, than your ability to cover claims? This is a very old story. Nothing particular here. So, making a long story short, maybe I should go back to the requirements. What did we do? Here we have requirements which are, I hope, complete with respect to integrity and availability. They don't mention any privacy issues on the one hand. On the other hand, they don't mention any identification issues. So it's really orthogonal, the security in respect to integrity and availability, and the security in respect to anonymity and privacy. Digital means it can be copied. Bits can be copied. And so we need some kind of witness which is only to accept the first copy. The first copy presented. Not the first copy done, but the first copy presented. And now, because we have a kind of witness, these systems only work well if the witness is contacted or can be contacted all the time. This means online system. If you have an online system, it works fine without any tamper-resistant devices. If we haven't an online system, then there are two ways out. One way out is assume or build tamper-resistant devices, which, because they are tamper-resistant and hopefully they are engineered well, never ever spend the same banknote twice, right? So you have solved the witness problem more or less by definition, more or less by the assumption and the construction of a device which doesn't do cheating. One possibility. And the second possibility, this is what we just had, you try to solve your problem cryptographically. And here the idea is, if you spend a banknote twice, it's unavoidable that after that you can be identified. And then you can be punished in the usual way. As good or as bad as people can be punished in the physical world, right? Okay, so this was the story about payment systems. Do you have any questions?
Excuse me, I still don't understand how the identity of the cheater can be identified if two different questions are.
Okay, so I go to this slide, and it's good if you ask the question. Maybe I was not explicit enough. So let's assume he gets commitment of R2, and he gets commitment of R2 plus I, right? And those get the commitment opened. So he has R2, and he knows R2 plus I. And both can prove that those values are really the values being inside the commitment, being inside the banknote. Then what do? They just collect the information, and they just add up R2 plus I, and the outcome is E.
What if
same as in the quantum?
What if he asks R1 but he gets R2 plus I?
What if he gets what?
R1.
No, sure. The assumption was we have here pairs. For each pair, each of the two says which one he wants to be opened.
Oh, for each pair.
For each pair. And the assumption was that at least for one pair, they do different decisions. Either because it's randomized and it's an overwhelming probability that they do different decisions, or in case we assume they might collide and work against the system, then because their identity determines which decision they have to make, so they are forced to make at least a different decision with respect to one of the pairs. And then we have the identity. Okay? So probably your question was less, how do we get the identity given the two values, but how can we force the two, or how can we make certain that really is the situation that both values are known, that this situation happens, right? Okay. Further questions?
Could you show slide 89, please? What would happen in this scheme if the computer of the recipient would crash after he gets a banknote? Is there a way to achieve the banknote again? Because then it would be...
Okay. So your question is, let's assume just after I got that, before I can do a backup, or maybe before it's written on my RAID disk subsystem, the computer crashes. So what to do? The answer is just ask the witness to resend the message. So I would assume, so if you want to implement it in a transactional setting, so the witness and the recipient, before the message is sent, somehow have a consistent state that now the witness is willing to send a message and the recipient is expecting a message. This message has some kind of identity. It has a message number, whatever. We have a transaction number. And now let's assume this is written to stable storage, here and there. Now the message is sent, and before it can be written to stable storage here, at the recipient side, the computer crashes. Sooner or later, hopefully you can reboot your computer. Even a Windows system can be rebooted most of the time after it crashed. So you find on your stable storage, oh, there was a transaction open. This is the transaction number, things like that. So you could ask, please send me the bits again. That's it.
And what would happen if there would be no backup of anything? As for example,
then I would say bad luck. Because, and again I would say, hey, this is nothing different than in the paper world. If you have no way to store your physical banknotes, if you have no way to store your transaction data, you have a problem. And so what is the good news? The good news here in this scheme is, hey, I don't assume anything which is unrealistic. So I don't assume bits can't be copied. Okay. By the way, start reading the literature. Sooner or later, if you are going to read about content protection or some very strange payment system, people will make the assumption bits can't be copied. Okay, no silly assumption like this, okay? I assume bits can be copied, so I can resend messages as often as I like. So you see, if you make the right assumptions, good assumptions are assumptions which don't hinder you to use the usual procedures. In the paper world, if you are losing some copy of your contract, what do? You ask, please, could we send another copy of the contract? Okay, here, same with bits. Second thing, I don't assume that any computers are tamper resistant. So in some sense, you can do backup as you like because your computer does what you want. If you are completely paranoid, you would say, I'm never going to use one computer, I'm using 3 computers, and after each step I'm doing a voting, what is the majority of my 3 computers. So you can make it as robust and expensive and cumbersome as you like. And of course, if you feel, hey, as a recipient, it's really hard to run a computer as we know it with storage and local backup, etc., etc. You could say, hey, Google, if you are willing to provide computing facilities for me, doing the handling of my data, if you offer that to me, and if I trust you, I can use it. So if you choose, it's your decision. I don't say do it, but if you choose, you could say, hey, this is not done on my computer, it's done in the cloud, provided by Google. By the way, you shouldn't be too much surprised if then the US government is monitoring all your payments. But if you have the feeling this doesn't upset you, it's okay. And if you like, it's only the Europeans doing it, then you should make sure that it's Google Europe providing the cloud. So all this can be done. So because we don't have tamper resistance, it means we can do all ordinary fault tolerance mechanisms. You can do whenever you like delegation, that if you have a party who is providing better computing services than you can provide for yourself, then use it. And of course, if I would do it personally, what would I do? I would say, hey, I have my local computer. Maybe I have a local backup. Maybe even I have several local backups. And if I have the feeling, hey, Google is offering a good backup service, and probably if you are encrypting your backup before sending it to Google, this is a splendid good idea, then I would have an additional backup with Google. Which means even if I'm traveling, and if I don't have any physical access to my backup at the moment, because if I'm traveling, usually I don't take all the hard drives, external hard drives with me. Okay? So I could access my backup online with Google. So you can apply it to this scenario. Everything you know from the database field, from the operating systems field, everything you learned here about security. Because I didn't do any unrealistic assumptions. Okay? Further questions?
I think of a criminal who stands in front of you with a gun and say, "Give me all your money."
Sure.
And he wants the banknote. The damage is unlimited, or isn't it? Because he can pay with this banknote several times, and if it is a physical banknote, you only could do this once.
First, if I can't cheat in the system in the sense that I can spend more money than I have, even if you put a gun on my head, I can't do it. In the offline system, yes. And therefore, I would only use an offline system for relatively small amounts and in situations where what you buy cannot be made to money very easily. If you buy Coke, and if it's in PET bottles, then it's pretty clear that after 9 months it's nearly unusable. Nobody is going to drink it anymore. If it was in glass bottles, it would be 3 years, but even then, okay. So the offline system I only would use for small amounts, and if it's a kind of transaction you can't undo on the black market easily. So I don't tell, or I don't want to say there's a zero risk. There's always some risk, and I try to spell it out. But there's, let's say, the compromise between convenience, I want to pay, even in situations where I'm offline, to taking some kind of risk of, okay, money can be spent several times and only this will be noticed later. Okay, further questions? Then probably, let's see, okay. Some concluding remarks to payment systems. The first thing is, in my argument, mainly, I try to emphasize, hey, I want to have legal certainty, you know what you are doing, it's clear, and liability on the same hand. And if you try to have both, your system usually gets clumsy to use. For example, an offline system is not possible if you want to have perfect legal certainty and liability. So often you can have several properties together, but then if you are adding some other properties, you have to do some kind of compromises. Second, if you look at payment systems, take with you that there's a fundamental distinction between online and offline systems. Online systems, I would argue, can be implemented nearly perfectly. And with offline systems, there's also some kind of compromise you make. Next thing is, if we are talking about digital money, the question is this a kind of debit system, or some people call it a prepaid system? That is, first you put real money on the desk of the bank, and then you get the digital representation. So you have to give real money before you can take part in the digital system. Is this a pay now system in the sense that at the moment where in cyberspace rights are transferred, the real money is transferred? Or is this a kind of credit system? For example, credit cards are such a kind of scheme where you can do payments and only after some time it's required that you really put money on the table. Usually when the bill comes from your credit card. Fourth property, are we only using special software, but general purpose computers, or are we using special hardware? Special hardware usually means chip cards, or in more general terms, tamper-resistant hardware. My feeling is, and I would argue, that if you really want to have a market success, then try to build it in a way that you are only using special software. Because if it runs on ordinary hardware, it means if it's well designed, if the user interfaces are nice, if it gives an advantage to everyone, then it can be fielded very, very easily. Next thing, if you are talking about digital payments, are we using or talking about a kind of universal means of payment? Are we talking about money in the sense that you can use it for arbitrary payments, for arbitrary items? Or are we mainly talking about a kind of bonus system? That these are coupons or these are miles or whatever you call it, and it can be only used for some purposes. Why do I make the distinction? Because at least in Europe, it's only banks which are allowed to provide some equivalent to real money. And the other side of the coin is that banks, of course, are obliged to keep track about user behavior, to send reports about unusual behavior to some authorities. So in order to be a bank, in order to be able to really deal with money, with electronic money, somehow you have to subscribe to do some kind of surveillance. If you are starting to run a bonus system, probably there's no need that you get a bank. Maybe the mafia could run it and would call, of course, would call it mafia euros or mafia miles or whatever. Maybe M miles and M euros. Mafia doesn't sound well. And now if they are going to generalize it enough that you somehow can use it like real money, then of course the legal regulation that banks have to monitor and supervise their users would run empty, would be in vain. I don't know. So if you get proposals, if you read proposals, if you're interested in politics, look how general, how multifaceted bonus systems become. If you are talking about normal money, of course, the question is your system handling one currency or many of them? So for example, a really important advantage of my credit card is that it's not only paying in euros, it's usable with mainly any currency. So I would assume that if you are building systems, build them from the outset as a multi-currency system. And the last question is, do I expect or do we expect having one digital payment system or multiple of them? And I would argue we'll have at least two of them. We'll have an online system for larger amounts of money, because for large amounts of money, security is crucial, and therefore it has to be an online system. And probably we need a system for small amounts of money and working offline. Maybe we need more, but at least those two I would assume we will need. Okay, that's it. That's what I wanted to say about payment, digital payment. Any further questions? Okay, then we generalize slightly. If we consider in which world we are going to live, what kind of world do we want to have with respect to privacy, there are two quite different pictures of such a world, and I took them from publications from David Chaum. One world is a world of personal identifiers. That is, if you have a user using here in David's publications a chip card, then in each of the transactions, this person is using the same personal identifier, in this example, 845. And of course, it might be much longer. If this is done that way, different organizations this user is interacting with, and organizations could be the government, it could be your bank, it could be your employer. All those organizations could use the identifier to link all the data of the different transactions they did with you and build up a dossier. And if your name is Smith, then it's dossier Smith. This is, at the moment, like the world is built. Maybe in Germany we don't have one universal identifier. Maybe we have several of them. You have the serial number of your passport. You have your name, place of birth, and birth date, which is a universal identifier if you take it together, etc., etc. Maybe it's not so simple that we have just one personal identifier, but maybe have a few of them. They can be linked, and all that can be used to collect data used and handed over at different occasions into one large, comprehensive dossier. David Chaum was one of the inventors of the pseudonym concept. And another world would look like that for different organizations, you are using different pseudonyms. And if this works well, then those organizations get the data they need. They get the data they need to give you service, to have a good relationship as a customer and service provider relationship. But they never are able to link across those blue boundaries. If it works fine, this is really nice. But there are many, many, many ways to link across this line. For example, if you are sending email to this organization, if you are sending email to that organization, even if you make sure that your email sender's address is different because you are using different pseudonyms, probably the IP address of your computer will be the same. And it's in the log files of the mailing system. Maybe it's even transmitted towards the mail agent of this organization and that organization. So this is a very nice concept if this pseudonymization is done not only at one layer, but pervasively towards or through all layers below, all layers which are used. So you see, if you want to have such a world where you can keep separate parts of your life separate, which I would argue is something which is really of value. It's a part of modern society that you can live different parts of your life mainly independently. If you want to keep that, then we really have to consider pseudonymization from the very outset when we built IT systems. And this was one of the reasons that I started with anonymous communication, avoiding identifiers, or static identifiers at least, or linkable identifiers at the very least, at the communication level. And then I continued to payment. And of course, there are more layers. In each transaction, probably you have communication and you have somehow money transfer. Of course, you have communication content. If you are the only guy on earth who does this very silly mistake in spelling, then this again is an identifier. Okay, now the tool would be to have your spelling corrected before sending an email, which might be for other reasons a good idea as well, because emails are read faster if they don't contain too many spelling errors. Okay. So, what do I want to say? This is what is taking place at the moment. And whether this is an identifier as your passport number, your IP address, think about IP version 6. Some people would say, hey, on your first birthday, you get your IP version 6 address valid for the whole of your lifetime. And they really start smiling. They are happy about it. And they think, oh, this is a very good gift for a child. Okay, so this is one world. In this world, I would say, hey, having static addresses, maybe even for a lifetime, this is a nightmare. Okay. I accept as a citizen that maybe for some purposes we will need at least part of this world, part of this implementation, that we might be able to link across domains. But we should be very cautious to do that. Because even if the good guys can do that, the bad guys will be able to do it as well. So Homeland Security Department is able to do it, then many other departments will be able to do it as well. So as a computer scientist, I'm mainly working towards this scenario with the pseudonymization, well knowing that in the beginning there will be many, many layers I didn't touch. There will be many different identifier schemes which still can be used if some effort is taken to undermine anonymity. Before we could have such a world as David Chaum described it in a famous article in 1985, so it's pretty old, it's now 25 years old, this picture. Before we can have that, it would require a major re-engineering of the technical infrastructure used in our world. So it's a really long-term effort. On the other hand, if we fully go this way, there won't be any privacy. If you want to keep some, at least for some applications, at least for some domains, I think we need something like this. Okay. So maybe this is a good last slide before the break. After the break, first I think I should ask, what questions do you have? We should have time to discuss that. And in case you don't have questions, then of course I can give you some, if you like, additional topics. And I once had to do a talk about the impossibility to regulate crypto. I already told you some stories about that. And I did lay it down in a more systematic fashion. So if you don't find anything better to do, I could talk to you to the topic, why is regulating security technology particularly hard or maybe even impossible? So break first and then see whether you have questions. I'm open to discuss anything, including any exercises you might have done, any questions you might raise. It's now your show. You decide what we do. Any questions, anything you want to do. So I don't see any questions, any suggestions what to do. Then this means I will continue with the last and optional part within this lecture. So the topic now is, if you have security mechanisms which make systems more secure, or if we frame it as multilateral security, if we have multilateral security or mechanisms supporting multilateral security, making systems more secure for some parties, can we make sure that bad entities, that criminals, that hostile governments can't use it? What's the background? Of course, if you make things more secure, if you make tools more powerful, you always have the feeling, okay, it's very nice to make the good guys more powerful, to protect the good guys better, but how about the bad guys? They will use the same tools. Can we prevent them to use the same tools? And of course, this is a large political debate. For example, in the United States, for many, many decades, it was forbidden to export cryptography, except it had a key length which was so small that you could do an exhaustive search over all possible values of the key. And this, of course, might make sense if the United States was the only country on earth which did know something about cryptography. Otherwise, not really need to import cryptography in your country if you are a bad guy from the United States, if the United States doesn't export it in a, let's say, in a state or in a quality which is secure. It's a long, long discussion. I came into this business not as a politician. It's the job of a politician always to be in favor of his or her own country. And of course, it's a job of a politician to be in favor of the government or the society he or she is representing. It's part of his or her role. I came into that as a scientist, and the question I want to answer, or I raised, is, hey, is there any possibility to regulate security technology in a way that it really has effect? Because if you, for example, forbid something to be exported, if it's exported nevertheless, then probably forbidding it is not really a good idea. It only costs you effort and paper to write it on. It's one more law or regulation, and if it hasn't any positive effect, then better do without it. So this brought me into that business. And in particular, it brought me into the business with respect to cryptography. And I came into that business during a time where in the United States there were buzzwords like key escrow or the Clipper chip. They tried to get again into control what kind of cryptographic use is done domestically. So it was in the United States not only a question about export of cryptography, but it was also a question of what kind of cryptography is used domestically. And we had mainly the same discussion in Germany. I was one of the scientists in this field, and I tried to find arguments and to make those arguments understandable to politicians and to public at large. And what I'm going to tell you now is mainly the essence of what I did at that time. So for the politicians and audience at large, I prepared, of course, a talk which started to explain what cryptography is about. But of course, we can skip that. You are now at least relatively good experts in cryptography, so no need to tell you something about that. Next, I will tell you a little bit about steganography. There's a separate lecture, so if you want to go deeper into steganography, Elke Franz gives you much more information about that. But for what we need, I will give it to you here now. Next, I will have a look at which proposals to regulate cryptography has been made. And then I will spell out what are the technical limits of regulating cryptography. And the final conclusion will be that proposals to regulate cryptography will harm the good guys only, not the bad guys. And of course, this is the worst thing which can happen with respect to regulation. If regulation just wouldn't hurt anybody except being expensive, then you would say, okay, it's a waste of resources. But if it's mainly hurting the good guy, then I would say, okay, regulating then is a particularly bad idea. Okay, let's see. Steganography. This is a scheme for steganography, and the example I used to give you a picture of what's happening is embedding or using pictures as cover. So steganography is about embedding a secret message into a cover message where the cover message looks quite normal. It's quite normal that people send around JPEGs. It's quite normal that people write love letters. It's quite normal that multimedia content is transmitted, right? So in steganography, we take a cover, we take a secret message. This may be a message which has already been encrypted, maybe, but can be plain text. We have an algorithm called embedding, which is run by the sender of the message, which has an input parameter called key. You may call it a steganographic key. But of course, a key is a key. It's just a bit string. And of course, you can use keys in cryptography. You can keys in steganography, maybe in other disciplines as well. So on these three inputs, a cover, which is taken from the real world, something which is sent usually over the network, an embedded secret message, a message to be embedded, which shall be kept secret, and even further, even its existence shall be kept secret, and a key. The embedding algorithm outputs a stegotext. This may be something which looks very much like this, maybe only a few bits, a few subtle colors have been added, or could be different dramatically. So maybe this embedding process could mimic some kind of compression or some kind of filtering or whatever. So there are different flavors of steganography. Some parts try to have minimal changes between cover and stegotext, and others say, okay, if we are going to change anything at all, then we are going to do larger changes and let's say mimicking some ordinary process. So for example, if you're sending back to your loved ones some pictures you take on your holidays, then maybe you don't send 5 megabyte JPEG using your phone and then paying tens of euros for the transmission afterward, right? No good idea. So maybe you compress it further. As in cryptography, the attacker is mainly controlling the channel between sender and recipient. Controlling the channel can mean he's getting all the bits and making some copy of it. And in some other applications, come to that later, controlling could mean the attacker might even modify some bits on the channel. Then, finally, we have a process which mainly is the inverse process of embedding, and I call that extracting. So the main purpose is, if you input here the same key as we did use here, so at the moment, all steganographic systems we know are inherently symmetric. It's an open research question whether there's asymmetric steganography. Of course, what you can combine is you can combine cryptographic key management with steganography. And then by using the key management and the steganography, you can have some properties which come close or go into the direction of asymmetric steganography. But at the moment, it's not that the steganography gets asymmetric, but the key management. So whether there's asymmetric steganography is an open research question, and if you get some very good answers on that, then you pass your PhD in a very short time. Okay. So if the same key is used here, then the algorithm extracting on input of the Stego text. And what is important, the Stego text only, not on input of the cover and the Stego text. On input of the Stego text only, outputs the embedded message. This is an important thing. The recipient mainly is interested in the embedded message. Maybe as an additional output, we'll have something which is pretty close to the original cover. But usually if you're using steganography, you don't care about the pictures you transmit. You care about the secret message you want to transmit. And now, what does a steganographic system achieve? If you compare to cryptography, if you assume with its cryptography, no cover here, and here we would have ciphertext, then what would an attacker know? An attacker would see, oh, there's something transmitted I don't understand. And if you are the Secret Service of some country and you read something you don't understand, then probably you get slightly upset. The consequence can be in some countries, if you're using cryptography, that some officers from the police or from the Secret Service show up and say, please explain what you are doing. We can't read what you are sending. This really happens. This is not fiction. This really happens in some countries. So what is the added value of steganography? The added value of steganography is that if it's well done, the attacker has no clue whether this picture is just a picture or whether this picture is a picture with some secret message embedded. And now, of course, the attacker could come to you and say, hey, please, could you tell me, did you embed a secret message into that cover? So please tell me, is this really a cover? Is this a Stego text? Then if you trust in your technology, what will your answer be? Your answer will be, by the way, I don't know what Stego text is. I just took a picture from my camera and I did send it. And maybe I compressed it slightly before, just not to pay too much fees to the local telco, right? That's all. I don't know what you are speaking about. Okay, so this is steganography used for secrecy. So these are domains of trust and area of attack, as you know it from cryptography. And what I explained to you is steganography providing secrecy of secrecy. It's not providing just secrecy of the message content. It's providing secrecy of the secrecy of message content. Right? This is more. And depending on in which country you are just using tools to conceal message content, this may be an important difference. So, what is the assumption? What are the aims? The assumption usually we make for steganography for secrecy is that the Stego text on the channel by the attacker is not changed. Not changed at all. Is this a realistic assumption? Okay, modern computing equipment is built such that if you send a message, it's exactly the bit pattern you send which will arrive. Of course, any computer in between could do some changes, but usually this isn't done. Why? You would harm everybody. So if you're doing some changes on the way, mainly you are making the channel less useful. And typically telcos want to offer useful channels because this is what they are paid for. So I would say in most scenarios, this is a quite realistic assumption. So what would we then like to have as a service provided by the system? That from here to there, it's exactly the same. So as in cryptography, the plaintext makes it without any changes to the recipient. Okay, of course, if you fear that there might be changes, you may do some authentication, maybe cryptographic authentication to the plaintext. Secondly, it's important that whether or not there is something embedded, that this cannot be detected. And of course, your scheme gets the more better, the more you can embed. Usually, this is probably your feeling. You can only use a smaller fraction of your cover to embed your secret message. And this is true. So let's say in steganography, people are talking about embedding rates of 1%, a 10%, something like that. But again, if you are talking about criminals, usually they don't have to run a video conference to organize their affairs. They want to exchange instant messages. They want to exchange short emails. And now if you compare, hey, you are sending your picture, maybe not over your mobile phone, but DSL flat rate within your hotel, then it's no problem sending a picture of 5 megabyte. And if you have 1% embedding rate, then this means 50 kilobyte payload. 50 kilobyte secret message can be encoded. This is longer than what usually an email is about. Okay, so this was steganography used for secrecy of secrecy. Sometimes, under the same name, you get a technology which I would use, or I would call, watermarking and fingerprinting. So here, the scenario is different. That is, we assume the attacker does severe changes to the file, and still what has been embedded here has to be somehow to be detectable there. There may be changes, but you should be able to prove here that what you extract here mainly was what you embedded here. So what is the use of watermarking and fingerprinting? The use is copyright protection, mainly. That is, in a file which is subject to copyright, you embed a watermark, for example, to tell the world, hey, this is intellectual property or artwork from Disney's. Please don't copy it and distribute it. Fingerprinting goes even one step further, because Disney or whoever might see that even if it's watermarked, nevertheless it can be copied and distributed. So maybe they come across the following idea. They say, hey, let's give everybody, when we sell it, a slightly different copy. A copy which is not only watermarked, but fingerprinted. So each fingerprint is different. Even it's the same artwork. And then if you can extract the fingerprint, you could prove is not really meant seriously. I wouldn't consider it a proof because it's symmetric, so it would be relatively easy to cheat. So in some sense, you could argue, okay, I know who distributed it further. So over the last years, I would argue that the main research results which I feel interesting, have been done in the area steganography used for secrecy of secrecy. But the main money came from the areas of watermarking and fingerprinting, because some companies thought, okay, this would provide them some tools to protect their intellectual property. It's in the meantime 11 years ago that mainly I did write in a foreword to an international workshop we had here, that I feel that watermarking and fingerprinting will fail. They will never ever be any security technique, in the sense that they can't be broken easily. Until now, I must say I was right. The technologies to break it succeeded much better than the improvements in watermarking and fingerprinting techniques. Andreas Westfeld, which was one of my colleagues within my group, now he's professor at HTW here in Dresden, he regularly won all, let's say, exercises to break watermarking systems. Okay, so what we will need here for the crypto debate is this. We will need that you can use steganography for secrecy. So now politicians and maybe some secret services, usually secret services of more powerful nations, thought about how could we regulate cryptography. And of course, if we would like to do that, it's done to fight crime. And maybe it's done, at least in the era of the Cold War, to fight, seen from the western part of the world, the Soviet Union, or as seen from the Soviet Union, to fight the Americans. So how could we regulate it? The most fundamental thing would be just to outlaw encryption. Just say cryptography in the wrong hands is so hard to break, so dangerous, that we are just going to outlaw it. By the way, it's really hard to outlaw the one-time pad, right? It's already published. You can explain the one-time pad within 2 minutes, at least to everyone who has a basic mathematical education. So at the very least, if you want to outlaw encryption, you have to outlaw mathematics, which probably is not a very splendid good idea if you want to be some kind of leading nation in technology. Second proposal would be to outlaw encryption, with the exception if key length is small enough. How realistic is this? If it's about a software implementation, I would say it's garbage. You just disassemble the program you get. You see what's the counter in the loop with respect to the key, and usually with a few changes, you can change the key space. For example, if RSA would be restricted to prime numbers of 100 bits each, then you only would need to find the constant, and then you had an implementation which is much better. Still another proposal was to outlaw encryption with the exception of key escrow systems, or with the exception of key recovery systems. Key escrow systems means systems where you have built in the system a kind of backdoor. Keys are escrowed. Whenever keys are generated, they are escrowed with some entity where law enforcement or the military could ask for the keys. Key recovery This was a kind of second generation of key escrow. Key escrow, after some while as a term, was burned in the sense nobody wanted it anymore. And then they renamed it and called it key recovery systems and tried a second time. Key recovery, the story behind that was, hey, if you encrypt your data, nice. And now if you lose your key, bad. Wouldn't it be good if you lose your key if we could help you? Great. You see the problem? I come to that back later. So at least in the second try, they tried to give it a flavor where the CIA hoped to have some argument why users should love key recovery. I was then one of the bad guys giving some arguments that users don't need that, but okay, let's see, comes later. Next story is, this comes from Great Britain mainly, that they say, let's make a ruling, we are only publishing public encryption keys within a public key infrastructure if the corresponding secret key is escrowed. So we are going to sign only public encryption keys by the Key Certification Authority, only if you get the secret key. The people in Great Britain thought they were quite clever when they thought that out. But we'll see it's nonsense because nobody needs it. So why should people be so stupid to do it, or maybe even to pay for it, if they can do without it? Let's see it later. Last argument, again from Great Britain. Great Britain, as you know, they had the Commonwealth. It was a large empire, so long tradition in cryptography. Therefore, a strong secret service, at least in the area of cryptography, and the feeling, hey, we are the champions. But this doesn't protect against stupidity. So the Great Britons made a law, and I think it's still law in Great Britain, that if you are using cryptography, and if there is suspicion that you are using cryptography for bad purposes, then you have to hand over the key to give the government an opportunity to check whether you are using it for bad purposes, yes or no. Okay. Why is this absolute nonsense? Because the one-time pad is already invented. So you can ask the Secret Service, hey, what plain text do you want to reappear? Maybe a nice text about the Queen. The Queen is the most important person on earth. We all love her, except in some weeks where Diana died and the Queen didn't behave as okay. Don't mention that. Maybe it's raising suspicion. So we love the Queen. Okay, and you choose the key you hand over, that the ciphertext and the key, as a result, give some positive text, maybe about the Queen or English policemen, or don't mention the story of Robin Hood or something like that. This may also starting to get dangerous. I don't know. Okay, so the one-time pad is already invented. So I would say the last possibility is nonsense. Okay, so now let's have some look at the key escrow debate. And before that, the public key infrastructure debate. All secret services on Earth said, or at least nobody said the contrary, all secret services on Earth agreed having digital signatures is okay. Why? Digital signatures don't protect secrets. It's no confidentiality technique. It's only protecting authenticity, integrity. And digital signatures are felt to be very important for e-commerce. Pretty clear. Nobody within London would be against e-commerce, right? So what is now the problem? If I have digital signatures, I can digitally sign bit strings, right? If I have secure digital signatures, I can sign them in a secure way, and you can test in a secure way whether they are really signed by me, right? And a public encryption key is nothing but a bit string. So if I have secure digital signatures, what will I do? I will not ask someone running a public key infrastructure, please, could you take my public encryption key within your public key infrastructure, maybe first charging me some money for it, and secondly, asking me to give you the secret key as well. What would I do? I would sign my public encryption key by myself. This is Andreas Fitzman's public encryption key. Please test the signature, and then you may rely on it, as long as you are not informed that I'm revoking my key. Okay. Nice. Doesn't cost me any money. And of course, I keep my secret decryption key by myself within my computer exclusively. So, asking people to hand over their secret decryption key, because otherwise you won't get part of a public key infrastructure, it's ridiculous. But still, I think it's tried. The next story is, what can we do if we do key escrow? And the people or the guys who were in favor of key escrow said, hey, key escrow, this is not a mass surveillance tool. We are not decrypting messages on a regular basis. We are only decrypting messages if we have a particular suspicion, or if we have a reasonable cause in American law lingo. So, what will happen? Let's assume A is communicating with B, so A will send its identity and maybe a public key of A to B using the key escrow key. So normally it's not decrypted if you do it early enough in the communication. So B will get to know A's identity and the public key. And then B can, of course, send back a message encrypted under the public key. So it can use the key escrow system for secure key distribution. And you can do even better. It would be a splendid good idea if your message back, which is encrypted with the public key you just got to learn, itself is encrypted under the key escrow system. Then it will never ever be noticed that you are doing inside of the key escrow system using another unbreakable, hopefully, cryptographic system. And it will only be detected at the very moment where you get suspicious and they want to have a closer eye on you. And then they will see, oh, that person really has done some preparations. So either it's a terrorist or it's a computer nerd. So hard to know. And of course, you can use hybrid encryption. So here it was mainly that within your public key system you did do all the work. And of course you can do hybrid encryption. Even worse, if people tell you, hey, we are building a key escrow system such that we cannot go back arbitrarily far. That is, we are going to implement key escrow such that maybe we can decrypt the messages of the last 2 months, but not the messages of 2 years ago. Then even worse. Then it's okay if quite early you use a key escrow system to exchange a symmetric key. And then you let time pass by. And then you can use the symmetric key. And even if it's now getting suspicious, if the original key exchange of the symmetric key is long enough in the past, then the key escrow system cannot be used to recover it. So making a long story short, if key escrow should really hinder people using good cryptography, it means that the key escrow system has to be decrypted and checked what's inside in real time all the time. And in particular, you never ever should be able to secure a key escrow system in the sense that you can't go back arbitrarily long. Because then even with the simplest scheme, you could use the key escrow system for key exchange. So the longer you start thinking about key escrow, you come to the conclusion it's nonsense. By the way, maybe some kind of nice story. I always told you when you build some new cryptographic systems, you should wait for some time, publish it, wait for feedback from your colleagues before you use it. And the Clipper chip, the original key escrow system the NSA designed, they tried to keep secret, of course. At least from their point of view, of course. But as was to be expected, they didn't succeed because it's really hard to keep something secret, which many people know. And then the research community got to learn that they had severe design flaws within their key escrow system. Why? It was a new property. The escrow property was new. And whenever you have a new property, you need peer review, even more urgent than if you are just rebuilding a system with properties you have a lot of experience with. So, by the way, it was funny that they had all the problems you would expect them to have. Usually, if you would take an agency seriously, you would just get rid of that agency because mainly they are wasting a lot of money. But okay, in the area of secret services, usually if they miserably fail, they even get more money and more legal authority. But okay, this is about politics. Next story, how we could use things which are not designed for secrecy, confidentiality, to provide for secrecy and confidentiality. This is the idea. It's by Ronald Rivest. He called it chaffing and winnowing. And the idea is we take symmetric authentication and some of the symmetrically authenticated messages are really authenticated. and some of the messages are wrongly authenticated or falsely authenticated, as I did write it here. And now you can transmit information. If it's authenticated well, maybe it's a 1. If it's wrongly authenticated, it's a 0. And in symmetric authentication, it's only the sender and the recipient who can check it. So effectively, you can transform authentication, an authentication channel, into a secrecy channel. And this can even be done better in the sense that the original sender need not cooperate. Even without the cooperation of the original sender, you could do it. And it could be done that the seemingly sender and the seemingly receiver don't notice what's happening. The channel is just used by others. Okay, so the conclusion is, if you want to control encryption, you have to get rid of symmetric authentication, which again is something network engineers don't like because it's a tool they need. Next argument, steganography. So this was the story we had here. When I started with steganography, my group at that time in Hildesheim, probably in the middle of Europe, was one of the first groups, if not the first group, starting with steganography. When we started, people told us, hey, how about key management? And key management, of course, has to be done in a way that it doesn't tell someone tapping the channels that this is a preparation for steganography, right? Okay, I had two arguments at that time, or I should say, I had one argument at that time. Hey. If we are talking about organized crime, these are people who know each other. These are people who meet each other. Isn't it easy to exchange a symmetric key? Okay, good argument. But then the argument I heard was, okay. Smaller circles of organized crime and maybe smaller circles of foreign secret services. Of course, they could use it. No way to do anything against it. But couldn't we still supervise public at large or larger circles? Okay, and now comes the solution into play I detected later on. So, going to tell you. So, first part we have, exchanging keys outside the communication network is easy for small closed groups, right? In particular, it's easy for criminals and terrorists. Sure. Large open groups, open means everybody can join. Large open groups need a method of key exchange which works without transmitting suspicious messages. At least without transmitting suspicious messages within the communication network. So we cannot use asymmetric encryption directly for key exchange. So you couldn't use RSA to encrypt a key and send it. But the NSA made sure we have a particular standard for digital signatures, the so-called Digital Signature Standard, DSS. The NSA brought into existence to prevent that RSA is used for signatures widely. What was the cause? What was the reason? The reason was that the NSA thought if RSA is used for digital signatures, RSA can be used for encryption, so we can't control encryption technology if RSA is used for digital signatures, so let's invent something which cannot be used for encryption. And they came up with the DSS, the Digital Signature Standard, which is mainly a Diffie-Hellman public key agreement, which uses core parts of Diffie-Hellman public key agreement. I don't mention the details, but Diffie-Hellman public key agreement we had. And this is what I'm going to use. So just as a repeat, Diffie-Hellman public key agreement, we started with a secret X here and a secret Y there. We had a public generator, G. So we take G to the X, G to the Y. This is published. And in particular, this is published as part of the digital signature standard. So everybody knows that from everyone. And then we have the property that G to the Y to the X equals G to the Y times X equals G to the X times Y equals G to the X to the Y. And of course, this is equally true if you do it mod something. So what would we do? We would use steganography and use Diffie-Hellman public key agreement just to exchange a symmetric key, or in particular not to exchange it, but to calculate it at the two different places where we need it, just using public information. So for me, it's really funny that a standard brought into existence, the digital signature standard brought into existence by the NSA, just to prevent secrecy, is the basic tool you might use to have a broad key management infrastructure for steganography. So it's really nice. Okay, so what is the state of the art? The state of the art is even public at large could use steganography if secure steganography exists. Of course, I have to admit that steganography is not as mature as cryptography is. So maybe steganography is at the moment where cryptography was at 1960 or something like that. But it's developing. We founded an international workshop for information hiding. This is the STIGO workshop worldwide. It's taking place in the meantime each year. Okay, and much progress is achieved. Okay, so what do we learn? We can use Diffie-Hellman key agreement to calculate at different places symmetric keys which match. And then we can use these symmetric keys, for example, in steganography, in case cryptography is outlawed or not available or forbidden. So what's the summary? The summary is, first, if there are secure digital signatures, there's secure encryption. You can use the digital signatures to sign and to exchange public encryption keys. Second, key escrow without permanent surveillance means opportunities for key exchange and multiple encryption. So I would argue key escrow only makes it worse, because key escrow ensures that you only get to know that your enemy is prepared at the very moment you know that this is your enemy and you have cause to investigate it. Without key escrow, maybe you would know earlier. last statement, if we have multimedia communication, there will be plenty of opportunities to use steganography. So if you have a national policy, let's say bringing multimedia to the population, bringing multimedia to different services, then this means in effect you are enabling steganography, you are enabling secrecy. That is, in a world where communication, where multimedia gets ubiquitous, it's absolutely clear that those who want will have confidentiality. So it's only the question, will everybody have confidentiality, or will only the computer nerds and the criminals have confidentiality? And as a citizen, I would argue it's better if everyone has, because the bad guys will have it anyway. I don't like it that the bad guys will have it anyway, but I can't do anything against that. So the story about losing your secret keys, the argument why key recovery should be something you love. This was the first picture I did about it, but maybe I just skip it and go to the next one, which is easier to communicate or to understand, I think. So this was my second try to explain it to the politicians, and I think it's better. So what's the main difference to make? The main difference is that we should talk about, are we protecting communication with cryptography, or are we protecting long-term storage? It's pretty clear that in cryptography, if you have two different purposes, you should use two different keys, right? This is one of the first lessons we learned. Don't use the same key for different purposes, all right? This is the most stupid error you can make. So, what are purposes we might do? We might use keys or cryptographic systems for encryption, and we might use it for authentication. And in authentication, I make a difference whether we are talking about symmetric authentication or asymmetric authentication. So, and now you see there are obviously 6 possibilities, and we can discuss whether key recovery is useful or only an unnecessary security risk. So let's start. If you talk about encryption, and if you're talking about communication, what do you do if you are just losing your key, your communication key? What do? You generate a new key pair, and you send to your friends, hey, this is my new key. And by the way, if you did send me an email encrypted with my old key over the last 10 minutes, please resend it encrypted under my new key. For communication, you don't need to recover your key you just lost. So an approach to, if you did lose your communication key, send an email to the NSA, please could you help me send you the key I just lost. It's ridiculous. You are generating a new key pair, you are informing your communication partner about your new keys, and they resend the messages if necessary. By the way, same argument for authentication. How about long-term storage? If it's about encryption, it's pretty clear. If you are losing the key of ciphertext, which you store, and nobody else has a copy of the plain text, then if you lose your key, you are in trouble. Yes, right. But here, for long-term storage, please use different keys than for communication. And for long-term storage, what do you make, or how do you prepare for losing your key? How would you make it? Probably you would remember, oh, we had a threshold scheme invented by Adi Shamir, so we could choose friends who keep shares of our key, right? So I would say even there, no need to ask the NSA for help. Same story for authentication with symmetric cryptography. Of course, if you did authenticate symmetrically, if you're losing your key, you can't check for authenticity. Okay, again, threshold scheme invented by Adi Shamir is probably the best solution. And last remark, if you did sign your backup digitally for integrity, so by the way, if you send your backup to Google, it's not enough that you encrypt it. It would be a splendid good idea if you digitally sign it additionally, because maybe you want to know that if you restore the state of your system, that you really have the former state and not some state added with some Trojan horses. Okay. So here, even for long-term storage and asymmetric authentication, no need to recover your secret key. It's good enough if you can still test the signature, but this is done with the public key. So no need to know the secret key for a long time. So to make a long story short, the NSA, the Americans, tried to tell the world you need key recovery, and they didn't make on purpose a distinction between communication and long-term storage. So some large companies like Siemens, you know, Siemens is a German company, who did provide backup storage and encryption for backup storage, they were quite enthusiastic about key recovery because they thought, oh, this gives us a larger market share. We're going to take over the communication business with encryption as well, so nice. So from some companies, the Americans got support. What I did in these months, I did fly several times to Bonn. At that time, the government in Germany was not in Berlin, it was still Bonn. And people asked me, oh, we had a crypto ambassador from the United States. They told us fantastic stories, how many advantages we get if we do key recovery. And then so please tell me, what are the advantages they promised to you? And then they started, and then I said, okay, no need you get it, no need, can be done differently. And finally, I did draw a picture like this. And then people in the government started to laugh about the Americans. Why could they assume we are so stupid? And of course, I gave them the impression, yes, this is true. But the real story is, if I didn't invest the time to explain it to them in very, very easy language, then probably the assumption of the Americans that the other governments are quite stupid with respect to crypto would have been true. So don't underestimate the Americans. It's not completely stupid what they do. And this is a general rule in security. Please don't underestimate your adversary. Okay, so this was a story about crypto regulation. The end of the story then was that I convinced Germany to vote against a mandatory key recovery guideline of the OECD. So the Americans, because they couldn't impose key recovery domestically, they did the usual trick, tried to get something you can't get domestically on an international scale. You see that at the European Union and at some other places in the recent past. At that time, the scenario was do it at the OECD. The OECD was the club of the industrialized countries. And the Americans wanted to have a mandatory key recovery decision at the OECD level. That is, all industrialized countries agree that if crypto is produced, it has to be key recovery crypto. And to make it binding, everybody has to agree. So it was enough to convince one country not to agree. Probably I was not the only person on earth arguing against it. So in the vote about that, Germany was against it, and two Nordic countries, two European Nordic countries. Probably there have been other guys who explained to the local government in these countries the problems. Okay, this was crypto regulation, and for me, this is one of the stories where I had the feeling that the German government really wanted to get the information what's going on. What do these Americans have in mind? Is this really true what they tell us? So they were really interested. So to sum up, at the left-hand side, you have all the proposals for crypto regulation we just had. At the right-hand side, you have the main arguments. So outlaw encryption, okay, then do steganography. Outlaw encryption with the exception of small key lengths, okay, do in addition steganography. Outlaw encryption with the exception of key escrow or key recovery system, okay, use key escrow or key recovery system for bootstrapping key exchange. Publish public key encryption keys only within PKI if corresponding secret key is escrowed. Okay, run PKI for your public encryption key yourself. And obligation to hand over decryption key to law enforcement during legal investigations, I can only recommend calculate the one-time pad accordingly. Then your investigators get the message you want them to get. In the former times, legal investigators would have argued, hey, the one-time pad is much too expensive, you can't use that, so please don't tell me you used it. In the meantime, okay, you already saw it, 16 gigabyte, quite affordable, quite portable, USB interface, so interfaces with each and every computer. So I would argue the one-time pad is very doable. It's a plausible way that you used it. Of course, you should make sure that if you send crypto, please don't have a preamble. It's PGP version 5.6.7.8 point something. If you later on want to argue that it's a one-time pad, please don't have a prefix or postfix, that it's something different, right? But please don't tell the bad guys. Otherwise, the procedure within Great Britain doesn't work properly. Okay. Some very few comments about the possibility or impossibility to regulate anonymous or pseudonymous communication. You can imagine that as crypto is something where politicians have the feeling, hey, how can we prevent that the bad guys use it? Anonymous communication is the same story. How can we make sure that the bad guys don't use anonymous communication? Maybe for organizing transportation of drugs, maybe for exchanging child pornography or whatever. And of course, I don't like child pornography to being distributed. I don't like delivery or transportation of drugs being organized. But again, can it be prevented? And if you look at anonymous and pseudonymous communication, then there are mainly explicit techniques, the mix network, the DC network, the message service, all that kind of stuff you learned. So you know the theory. And in practice, I can only say the practical system's getting better each year or two. There's still some difference. In theory, we know how to do it. In practice, the systems are not too strong, but they are getting better all the time. And secondly, I should just mention some workarounds. That is, if we would forbid the explicit techniques, what workarounds would still be there? First, explicit techniques. We have the Anon system developed within my group. It's an open source project, so mixed proxies can be set up all over the world. So these are the possibilities: use our system or use Tor. There are some systems which only have a single Anon proxy, which just strips off the sender's address and inserts as sender address the sender address of the Anon proxies and then forwards the message. First, this is inherently weak because this proxy knows which has been replaced. He knows sender and final recipient of the information. And secondly, if you would be a secret service and your duty would be to tap all interesting messages worldwide, or at least find out who communicates to whom, what would you do? Either you are starting tapping all the networking traffic worldwide, or you set up an Anon proxy and publish your services and get all those people who think they have something to hide to use your Anon service. So if it's about single Anon proxies, many of them are organized or operated by secret services and maybe even organized crime. So if you use it, then use a decentralized system where you have to have the cooperation of many entities to know who is communicating to whom. And this decentralized approach cannot be forbidden locally. Because if you do, let's say in Germany, or if you do in the European Union, a law that these kinds of services are illegal, what's going to happen? They are then operated in a different country. Or your law that they are illegal within Germany or the European Union, or this law is challenged before a court. Also something we just saw in Germany. So, what can be done implicitly if you want to do anonymous communication? Maybe in some places you find public phones you can use. Just insert coins. Make sure that you are wearing gloves while inserting coins. Otherwise you have fingerprints on your coins. And make sure there's not a video camera close by. So maybe more realistic, you are using a prepaid phone. How do you get one? Okay, you go into a shop and buy one. In Germany, then regularly you are asked to show your passport. Okay, then it's not really an anonymous anymore. So what would you do if you want to have an anonymous German phone? I would go either to Bahnhof Neustadt or to Hauptbahnhof in Dresden and doing a deal with one of the people being there and drinking wine. My deal would be, okay, I give you money. You get to buy me a mobile phone. And during you buy a mobile phone, I get you some bottles of wine. This is a particularly good deal for you because first, in the shop selling wine, probably you are a persona non grata because they don't want you to have you here. But for me, they will give me wine if I pay for it. And in the mobile phones shop, probably you never was there. So if you take your passport with you, you get a mobile phone. And okay, it's a good deal for both of us. After that, I have an anonymous phone. And here's some more wine, and so we both are happy. I'm not saying we both are healthy, but we both are happy. Next, there are many, many open, unprotected VLANs. Some of them are still open because the first generation of VLANs had no encryption on the channel by default. So they are open because from the very beginning they have been open. And secondly, there are some VLANs which are open because it's a kind of religious belief of some people to keep their VLAN open and to be used by everyone. Okay. Next, there are many mobile phones which can be used over Bluetooth. So this gives you another entry point into a communication network. So my argument would be, if I would be a criminal, and if I would need anonymous communication, maybe I wouldn't do it that way. Because if these techniques work fine, okay, I'm anonymous within a few 10,000 people. But it's only, at the moment, a few 10,000 or maybe a few 100,000 people. It's not several million people. If I do it that way, I'm anonymous within some million people. So probably it's a more clever strategy. Therefore, trying to regulate this, what mainly is done by the politicians, doesn't make too much sense as long as this still works. So my feeling is I would be very happy if I would see a way to make sure that cryptography is only used for good purposes, assuming I am able to define what is good and bad. I would be very happy if I would be able to make sure that anonymous communication or pseudonymous communication is only used for good purposes, assuming I'm able to decide what is good and bad. But for very fundamental reasons, I think it can't be achieved. And so it's my belief that it's better to give the positive value of privacy, ease of use, security to everyone than to give it only to the computer nerds and criminals. And therefore, I would argue, let's have an infrastructure, a cyber infrastructure, which provides privacy and security. In the physical world, I have the feeling we get so much surveillance, video cameras, audio recordings, all kinds of tools, that I think having, at least within the cyber space, some privacy. Whereas in the physical world, you are going to have less and less privacy. This is a good thing to keep a balance. Of course, or at least I would say, this is true in middle of Europe. maybe if you go in some national park in the US, many days of walk away from any street, or if you are in the midst of Kamchatka, or somewhere at a really remote place, then maybe you still have privacy in the real world. But in the midst of Europe, I'm pretty sure it's going to decrease. It's going to noticeably decrease over the next years. I'm not happy about that, but this is how I expect it to happen. So, as a citizen, I think privacy in cyberspace is a good idea. As a scientist, I can say you can't prevent it for those who really want to have it. So the recommendation is give it to all. That's what I wanted to say. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I hope I could, in some sense, answer your questions. If further questions arise, send me an email or send an email to the list. Or come to my office. Maybe you organize in smaller groups, and if you have common questions, come to my office. Let's discuss it. And with respect to the oral examination, please be prepared to get very simple and very fundamental questions. I'm not interested in some details somewhere which I can't remember. So I will only ask you things which I think are very fundamental and I know by heart. If you are not allowed to take with you the scriptum for the examination, I'm not allowed to use it as well. I think this is just a thing of fairness. So I can only ask you things where I have the firm belief we should both know it. And the main thing is, I want you to show not that you know something, but that you are able to apply it, that you are able to do some conclusions, that you are able to work as an engineer within this field. This is what I'm interested in. And whenever in an oral examination you don't understand the question, please ask back. Make first clear the question is understood, and only then start answering. Okay? So I assume I will see you, most of you, in this situation somehow. And the experience is nearly each person coming to me for an examination is leaving me much more luckily or much more, how should I say, happily than he comes or she comes. And this is a good experience. Of course, I cannot save you the time and expense to learn something, to master something, and to be able to apply something. This is your duty, but the expectation and experience tells me most of you are able to do it, and nearly everyone is happy in the end. Okay, so I hope it will be the same for you. See you sooner or later.